Joe Rogan did not become famous all at once. His rise was gradual, cumulative, a layering of disciplines, interests, and media platforms that eventually made him one of the most recognizable and influential voices of the digital era. To understand how Joe Rogan became Joe Rogan, it's necessary to look at each phase of his career as a chapter in a larger story about media disruption, personal reinvention, and the appetite for long-form, unscripted conversation in a fragmented culture. Rogan was born in 1967 in Newark, New Jersey, into a working-class family. By his early teens, his family had moved to Massachusetts, where he found a strong outlet in martial arts. Rogan's early dedication to Taekwondo and later Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu reflected a pattern that would define much of his life, a tendency to dive deeply into disciplines that blend physical intensity with personal mastery. His first brush with national attention came not from fighting, but from comedy. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, Rogan worked the stand-up circuit in Boston and New York, eventually landing television roles, most notably as Joe Garreley, the eccentric electrician on NBC's news radio from 1995 to 1999. The show offered him visibility, but it didn't define his persona. Rogan has since described his acting work as more of a job than a passion. His identity was still forming, a mix of martial artist, skeptic, comic and question asker, looking for a format that matched his mind. That format arrived in two unexpected forms: reality television and podcasting. In 2001, Rogan became the host of Fear Factor, a role he accepted with some hesitation. The show was absurd, often grotesque, and gleefully confrontational. Yet it was also a strange fit for Rogan, who approached it with a kind of bemused detachment. It paid well, and it exposed him to millions of viewers, but again, it was a means to an end, not the end itself. The real turning point came in December 2009, when Rogan and his longtime friend Brian Redban began recording casual conversations and uploading them to the internet. They called it the Joe Rogan Experience. At first it was informal, chaotic, and technically inconsistent. There was no script, no theme, just Rogan talking to friends, often comedians or MMA fighters, about everything from psychedelics to politics to the nature of reality. Unpolished as it was, the show found an audience, and then, over time, it found millions. Before he was known as a podcasting juggernaut or MMA commentator, Joe Rogan was simply a guy chasing stage time. In the late 1980s, stand-up comedy was still thriving in small clubs across America, a mixture of sharp wit, self-deprecation, and the occasional bar fight. Rogan entered the scene not from drama school or an Ivy League writing program, but from martial arts dojos and pool halls. He was, in a word, raw. What he had, however, was presence, a loud, physical stage persona paired with an intensely curious mind. His early material often circled around observational humor, body image, and the absurdity of everyday life. Friends and fellow comics described him as a comedy gym rat, obsessed with improving, rehearsing, and experimenting. He wasn't just telling jokes, he was studying what made people react. Rogan moved to New York City, which was then, and remains, one of the hardest places to earn respect in stand-up. He performed in venues like the Comedy Cellar and Catch a Rising Star, often alongside names who would later become household figures. He was never the alt comic, nor the archetypal clean TV-friendly jokester. He lived somewhere in the middle, brash, unapologetic, but thoughtful underneath the delivery. Rogan moved to New York City, which was then, and remains, one of the hardest places to earn respect in stand-up. He performed in venues like the Comedy Cellar and Catch a Rising Star, often alongside names who would later become household figures. He was never the alt comic, nor the archetypal clean TV-friendly jokester. He lived somewhere in the middle, brash, unapologetic, but thoughtful underneath the delivery. Although Rogan wasn't the lead, his performance was memorable, a kind of comedic foil who grounded the show's more eccentric characters. It introduced him to a mainstream audience, even if it didn't fully showcase his worldview. News radio was a network show with boundaries. Rogan, even then, was someone who liked to explore the edges. But tragedy marked the end of the show's golden era. In 1998, Phil Hartman was murdered by his wife in a shocking act of domestic violence. The cast never fully recovered, emotionally or professionally, and the show ended a year later. With news radio behind him, Rogan returned to stand-up full-time. Yet he had become more than a club comic. He was now a public figure, one whose next move would help define the rest of his career. And that next move, surprisingly, was Fear Factor. In 2001, NBC approached Joe Rogan with a proposal that initially struck him as ridiculous. The network was launching a new reality show, part game show, part psychological endurance test, called Fear Factor. Contestants would be asked to perform increasingly bizarre and terrifying challenges, eating insects, leaping between moving vehicles, submerging themselves in cages of snakes. They needed a host who could navigate the absurdity without losing composure, someone with equal parts confidence and humor. Rogan wasn't their first choice, but when other candidates passed, he said yes. For Rogan, Fear Factor was never about artistic expression. It was a job, but it was a lucrative one, and it came with unparalleled exposure. Each week, millions of viewers watched him deliver dry one-liners while standing beside people, vomiting into buckets or dangling from helicopters. Rogan played it cool, often leaning into the ridiculousness with a smirk and a raised eyebrow. He wasn't above the chaos, but he wasn't absorbed by it either. In hindsight, it was an early look at the balancing act he would later master on his podcast, ride the line between absurdity and sincerity. Fear Factor ran for 6 seasons from 2001 to 2006, with a brief revival in 2011. During that time, Rogan became a recognizable television personality, even if not always taken seriously by critics. His association with reality TV, still seen at the time as lowbrow, meant that some corners of the entertainment world dismissed him as a novelty. But Rogan was playing a longer game. He often said in interviews that the money he made from the show gave him the freedom to pursue projects he actually cared about, like comedy, mixed martial arts, and later, podcasting. At the same time, Fear Factor served as a crucible for Rogan's observational skills. In private, he studied the contestants closely, what made them panic, what made them endure, and how people reacted when pushed to their limits. He later compared hosting the show to performing psychological experiments with a camera crew, a revealing comment that underscored his genuine curiosity about human nature. Still, by the time Fear Factor wrapped up, Rogan knew he didn't want to be remembered just as the gross-out guy. He returned to his roots in comedy with renewed focus, sharpening his stand-up act and leaning harder into controversial, thought-provoking material. He was no longer just trying to be funny, he was now asking big questions about society, censorship, politics, drugs, and philosophy. He was developing a voice, a point of view, and he was starting to wonder what it might look like to have real, unfiltered conversations with people who felt the same. But before that idea could take shape, Rogan found himself stepping into another unexpected spotlight, this time as a commentator in the rapidly growing world of mixed martial arts. While Fear Factor made Joe Rogan a household name, it was his involvement with the UFC Ultimate Fighting Championship that earned him serious respect among an entirely different audience, one that valued technical knowledge, authenticity, and passion over celebrity status. Rogan had been a martial artist long before he was ever on stage. In his teens, he trained in Taekwondo, eventually winning the US Open Championship as a lightweight. Later, he would become a black belt in both Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and 10th Planet Jiu-Jitsu, training under legends like Jean-Jacques Machado and Eddie Bravo. For Rogan, martial arts were never just a hobby, they were a lifelong discipline, almost a philosophy. He began working with the UFC in 1997 when the sport was still on the fringes, more spectacle than sanctioned competition, often dismissed as human cockfighting. At first, Rogan served as a backstage interviewer for UFC 12, a role he took not for money, but because he was genuinely obsessed with the sport. He declined to continue due to the travel demands, but by 2002, with the UFC gaining traction under Dana White and the Fertitta brothers, Rogan returned, this time as a color commentator. His commentary quickly stood out. Unlike many mainstream sports broadcasters, Rogan wasn't just calling the action, he was breaking it down, often in granular detail. He explained why certain positions mattered on the ground, how striking styles clashed, and what a fighter's body language revealed about fatigue or strategy. He did it with enthusiasm and clarity, making the fights more accessible to newcomers without insulting the intelligence of die-hard fans. Over time, Rogan became the voice of the UFC, not officially, but culturally. Fans trusted him, fighters respected him, and even critics acknowledged that his commentary added depth and legitimacy to a sport still fighting for mainstream recognition. His partnership with play-by-play man Mike Goldberg and later John and Nick formed the foundation of a broadcast style that was both educational and electric. Rogan's emotional reactions, whether a shout during a knockout or a stunned silence during a submission, reflected what fans felt in real time. He wasn't detached, he was right there with the audience. But his value went beyond color commentary. Rogan championed fighters' rights, advocated for better judging and medical oversight, and used his platform to promote lesser-known athletes he believed deserved recognition. He wasn't an employee of the UFC, he was an independent contractor who happened to care deeply about the sport. As his role grew, Rogan's visibility among male audiences, particularly younger and more digitally connected fans, began to swell. And while he was still performing stand-up regularly, something new was beginning to form in his mind, a desire for long, unstructured conversations. The quick sound bites of sports commentary and the tightly edited nature of TV didn't suit him anymore. That need for depth, for exploration, for freedom would give birth to the project that would change not only his life, but the entire media landscape. In December 2009, Joe Rogan sat down in front of a webcam with his longtime friend and podcast producer, Brian Redban. There was no plan, no studio, no intro music or sponsors. Just two guys talking on a live stream, taking questions from fans and riffing about whatever came to mind, from hallucinogens to conspiracy theories to comedy gossip. It was rambling and raw, often absurd, and occasionally brilliant. They called it the Joe Rogan experience. Nobody watching that first episode could have predicted what it would become. There were already podcasts by 2009, but the medium was still in its infancy. Mostly niche, low-budget shows with limited reach. Rogan's version was different. He wasn't trying to sound polished or professional. He was trying to sound real. From the beginning, the Joe Rogan experience had a few things going for it: time, range, and curiosity. Rogan let conversations breathe. Episodes often ran 2 or 3 hours, unheard of in traditional broadcasting. The guest list was eclectic. Stand-up comedians, MMA fighters, neuroscientists, authors, psychonauts, political thinkers, and people you'd never heard of until they started talking. Rogan asked the kind of questions people were thinking, but often felt too embarrassed to say out loud. What set him apart wasn't just who he interviewed, it was how he listened. He wasn't a trained journalist, and he made no effort to pretend to be one, but he was genuinely curious. That curiosity, and at times naive, at times profound, invited guests to let their guard down. It created space for long-form discussion in a culture increasingly dominated by headlines and hot takes. The format clicked. Viewers, many of whom had grown tired of mainstream media, flocked to the podcast. Some came for comedy, others came for MMA talk. Still others were drawn to the more cerebral episodes featuring people like Sam Harris, Graham Hancock, or Dr. Rhonda Patrick. The show wasn't about anything in particular, it was just about people, and that was the appeal. By 2015, the Joe Rogan experience was pulling millions of views and downloads per episode. Fans watched on YouTube, listened on Apple Podcasts, and shared clips on Reddit. The show's influence began to exceed its platform. It wasn't just a podcast, it was becoming a cultural force, especially among men aged 18 to 45. And with that influence came controversy. Rogan's willingness to entertain fringe ideas, host divisive figures, and discuss taboo subjects made him both admired and criticized. Some praised him for being open-minded and fearless. Others accused him of giving a platform to dangerous misinformation. Rogan, for his part, insisted he wasn't a journalist or authority, just a guy having conversations. That framing didn't stop the growth. It may have even fueled it. As the 2010s wore on, the Joe Rogan experience became not just a podcast, but a phenomenon, a place where comedians, fighters, scientists, thinkers, and outcasts all shared the same table. In an era of bite-sized content, Rogan offered something slower, messier, and more human. And then, in 2020, came the deal that cemented his status as one of the most influential media figures on the planet. In May 2020, the Joe Rogan Experience signed an exclusive licensing agreement with Spotify. The deal was estimated at $100 million, though later reports suggest it may have been significantly more. It was one of the largest contracts ever in digital media, and it shook the podcasting world to its core. Until then, Rogan had been a fiercely independent creator. His podcast was hosted on YouTube and freely available across platforms like Apple Podcasts and Stitcher. Fans could watch, listen, and clip episodes without friction. The move to Spotify signaled a dramatic shift. Rogan's entire library and all future episodes would be hosted exclusively on Spotify's platform. For Spotify, the deal was strategic. They wanted to transition from being a music streaming service to a full-spectrum audio giant, and Rogan was the Trojan horse that could bring millions of loyal listeners with him. Almost overnight, Spotify's position in the podcast space became dominant. But for Rogan's fans, the reaction was mixed. On one hand, it was a huge win. Their favorite host was now being paid handsomely and could afford even greater production and guest access. On the other hand, some worried that exclusivity meant censorship, loss of freedom, or a betrayal of the podcast's independent spirit. Those fears weren't entirely unfounded. Upon the initial migration to Spotify, dozens of past episodes, especially those with controversial guests, were missing from the platform. This triggered immediate speculation about corporate oversight and content restrictions. Rogan insisted he had full creative control and denied any formal censorship. Still, the absence of certain interviews cast a shadow over the deal's no-strings-attached presentation. Then came the COVID-19 pandemic. As the world locked down and people turned to podcasts for information and entertainment, the Joe Rogan Experience became a lightning rod for the culture wars. Episodes with guests like Dr. Robert Malone and Brett Weinstein, both critics of mainstream COVID narratives, were accused by public health experts and journalists of spreading misinformation. The controversy peaked in early 2022 when music legend Neil Young pulled his catalog from Spotify in protest, citing Rogan's COVID content. Other artists followed suit. A media firestorm ensued and Spotify's stock took a hit. Rogan responded with a video on Instagram defending his podcast as a platform for open dialogue and promising to do better in providing context and balance. Spotify stood by him, barely. The company reaffirmed their commitment to free speech while quietly adding disclaimers to certain episodes. The whole episode underscored the tension between free expression and corporate responsibility, and Rogan was now at the center of that debate. Despite the drama, the show's numbers remained staggering. By the end of 2022, the Joe Rogan Experience was still the most listened to podcast in the world. His reach was bigger than most legacy media networks, and crucially, he had retained his audience's trust, or at least their loyalty, by being consistent in his tone, style, and unpredictability. In 2024, Spotify renewed the deal, reportedly restructuring it to allow some content back on YouTube and broadening its monetization model. Rogan, ever the pragmatist, got the best of both worlds, the check and the platform. By the 2020s, Joe Rogan had become more than just a comedian, commentator, or podcast host. He was a cultural institution. Whether loved, hated, or misunderstood, his influence was undeniable. For supporters, Rogan represents something rare in today's media ecosystem, an open-ended space for dialogue. His podcast isn't edited into sound bites. It doesn't come with a script or a party line. Guests are given time to speak, to wander off track, to disagree, or even contradict themselves. That format appeals to people across the political spectrum who feel exhausted by the combative black and white tone of mainstream news. Critics, however, argue that Rogan's reach comes with a responsibility he doesn't always honor. By giving airtime to controversial guests, including those who promote pseudoscience, conspiracy theories, or political extremism, he has been accused of amplifying misinformation under the guise of open discussion. Rogan often responds by saying he's just a comedian, not a journalist, but many find that distinction increasingly hard to maintain given his massive platform. That tension between intent and impact defines much of Rogan's public legacy. He's a self-described libertarian-leaning skeptic who also embraces spiritual thinkers. He's a gun advocate who supports universal health care. He's smoked DMT with Silicon Valley technologists and grilled presidential candidates on public health policy. That ideological fluidity makes him hard to pin down, which is both his appeal and his most common criticism. In other words, Joe Rogan is a paradox. To his fans, he's honest. To his detractors, he's reckless. To media executives, he's a revenue machine. To cultural critics, he's a symptom of our fractured information landscape. But to most casual listeners, he's just a guy in a studio having long, weird conversations and doing it well. It's also worth noting that Rogan's impact on podcasting is nearly unmatched. He helped transform podcasts from niche hobby to mainstream medium. His format, long-form, unscripted, guest-driven, has been copied by thousands of creators. His presence on Spotify likely brought in millions of new users, and even his controversies have forced the industry to wrestle with questions of moderation, platform responsibility, and the boundaries of free speech. He's also influenced real-world decisions. Politicians have courted his audience. Authors have seen their book sales skyrocket after appearing on his show. Entire debates about nutrition, psychedelics, AI, and censorship have been ignited or reignited on his couch. Joe Rogan didn't become famous through one path. He became famous through 5 or 6 of them, all converging into a strange, singular career. He was a martial artist, then a comic, then a sitcom actor, then a reality show host, then a fight commentator, then a podcaster, and now a cultural lightning rod. What ties all those identities together isn't just talent or luck. It's a mindset. Skeptical, curious, relentless, and unafraid to be misunderstood. Rogan has always followed his interests, no matter how impractical or controversial, and he's built an empire out of being himself, flaws and all. In a media world where everyone is trying to say the right thing, Joe Rogan got famous by saying what he was thinking, and by giving others the space to do the same. That, more than anything, may be his most lasting legacy.